Pre-dawn light rests on the Aegean like a hand calming a restless animal, and the boat drifts above the broken rim of the Santorini caldera where the water carries a faint scent of pumice and brine. Instruments click alive. Multi-beam returns, a scrolling ribbon of bathymetry, temperature, and salinity in slow, even numbers. Divers breathe through regulators, warm fog on their masks, minds narrowing to the quiet work ahead. A measured descent along a line dropped to a site first noticed by sidescan sonar as a geometry out of place on an otherwise natural slope. The sea is cool and green and layered with memory, and as they sink past 10 meters, then 20, the surface becomes a muted disk above them and the only sounds are breath, the soft hiss and reply of air, and the small percussion of silt against metal. The bottom gathers them with a hush. Lamps bloom, revealing a patch of seabed that is not seabed at all but paved stone. Pale slabs of limestone fitted so closely that only narrow seams accept the drift of sand. A grid is established without hurry. Tapes stretched, transects staked, numbered tags placed blinking in the dark. Photogrammetry begins. The slow discipline of overlapping frames will later knit into a faithful skin of this place. A map built from light. Nothing is moved. Nothing is touched that does not need to be. The water keeps its rules. There are columns here, not whole, but present enough to show intention. Drums of marble toppled and half-sunk in algae. A capital wedged like a fallen crown against a ridge. To the south, a rectangular depression describes the footprint of a structure. Along its edge, a channel runs, carved with an exactness that suggests repeated use. A lamp passes and catches relief. A procession of small figures, their hands lifted toward a circle incised with radiating lines. The style is not purely Minoan, yet the impulse toward rhythm, toward ordered movement and light, feels related to the frescoed life still sleeping in Akrotiri's rooms above sea level. In this basin, the ash of the mid-2nd millennium BCE, the Dharan eruption that thundered across the Aegean, lies within the pores of stone, fusing fragments where heat found them. Underwater microscopes will later show tephra lodged in microfractures. The strata remember what the surface rephrases into story. A bronze disc emerges from the silt with the gentlest breath from a handheld dredge, teased until it frees itself like a moon rising. Concentric circles. A narrow spoke. Corrosion has eaten its edges but left an idea intact. Bronze like this has traveled. The tin that made it possible often came from far coasts. In a lab, isotopic signatures may speak of Iberian or Anatolian routes, the same web of exchange that moved saffron obsidian stories. The divers do not know this yet. They only feel the slow press of time made visible. Between toppled drums of marble, amphorae cling to coral as if coral grew to keep them from drifting away. Some carry residues that might still whisper contents. Oil, wine, grain. Some hold only water now, and in the next small fish pivot like living punctuation. A low step descends from the rectangular foundation toward a paved court whose patterns are almost erased. The court points not to north but to the path of light. A compass needle wavers here where it should be calm. The basalt in the cliff may cause it, or something in the stones themselves. The divers note it and move on with the steady patience learned from tide and training. Above, the scar of the caldera reminds the island of its violence. Around 1600 BCE, the best radiocarbon range is a century's width, but the signal is clear. Pressure grew in the magma chamber until the island shattered. Pumice rafts drifted for weeks. Ash rose into the stratosphere. There are harbor layers in northern Crete and along the Turkish coast where tsunamis laid down abrupt sheets of sand and shell, a signature of impact that later hands read with quiet certainty. Cultures fold and refold around events like this. Some myths take tenderness from them, others take warning. Plato will write of an island power that fell in a single day and night of misfortune. Solon will listen, and priests at Sais will open drawers of records and lay out a world older than Athens. A story finds its anchor where the sea keeps a ruin and the ruin keeps a breath. On the fourth day, a mosaic is noticed under a cowl of sediment where the current has thinned the cover. Brushes whisper. A lattice appears. Not a straight line but an arc, a habit of curves and circles like ripples that forgot to fade. There are towers within rings. A city held by water. Not exact, never proof, but an image with enough resonance to slow hands. In one corner, the tesserae have shifted to depict waves rising as if in ceremony rather than assault, and along the lowest ring, figures bow with their faces toward the sea. A diver's chest tightens at the thought that they are not surrendering. They are participating. No one speaks down here, and yet the sight carries a tone the hydrophones catch as a persistent tremor, probably the small talk of earth and tide in the caldera's bones. Feels like breathing. Later, in a comm lab, the spectrogram will resolve to a narrow band of natural noise, but in this gentle pressure, with light falling in green ladders and silt moving like fine snow, it is easy to accept another reading. A city exhaling as it sleeps. Artifacts are recorded and left. Measurements are redundant on purpose. The ROV arcs across the court to map the extent and returns trailing a faint comet of disturbed sand that settles again into the language of the bottom. A carved lintel lies face down. The decision is made not to lift it this season. There is time for caution. Anything that has waited 3,500 years can wait a little longer. Notes grow careful. Orthostate blocks. Double tenon seating. Channel incised with 0.7 centimeters pitch, consistent across 3 meters. Numbers keep faith with the visible world, and yet each number in the wet notebook seems to carry a second script beneath it, something like a prayer for the right question. At the margin of the court, a pedestal bears a statue with its forearm intact. The palm faces outward, a quiet check against hurry. The stone has lost its fine skin. Fish have read the lines of the hand more often than people now. A fingertip keeps its curve, and inside that curve a grain of black volcanic glass is caught, shiny as a drop of night. Obsidian traveled through these islands long before palaces rose. Knives passed from hand to hand across small harbors, each edge teaching the next. This place learned layers of time and kept them. Neolithic sailors finding routes by stars. Minoan engineers laying drains with a slope no steeper than what the water wanted. Later Greeks walking over older stones without knowing. The eruption sealing a sentence before it could end. That night, in her journal, she wrote the final entry. Salt preserves what ink cannot. The sea does not read in letters, but in echoes. Perhaps every page we write is only waiting to be rewritten by the tide. The wind fell quiet. The horizon glowed faintly. Somewhere beneath, in the library carved for water, pages of stone turned slowly in the dark. Each current a reader, each ripple a remembrance. And in that patient motion, the ocean kept its oldest story. That nothing truly vanishes, it only changes its way of being remembered. The expedition reached the island at dusk, a scar of volcanic rock adrift in the southern Aegean, unnamed on modern maps but long whispered about in maritime folklore as Nimos of the Ash Moon. It lay barely above the waterline, ringed by cliffs streaked with obsidian veins that caught the last light and flared like liquid metal. The Orphean II anchored offshore, its hull turning slowly in the current. From the deck, the island looked empty, a silhouette of ruin and salt. But in the failing light, the geologists noticed something unnatural. A straight alignment of stones, black and glassy, leading from the beach toward a central rise. Dr. Ilara Merkos returned to the expedition for this final leg, the island survey that some among the crew called the end of the map. For weeks they had been tracing faint correspondences between the submerged sites they'd discovered. The plaza of the Atlantean outpost, the drowned observatory, the resonant monolith, the library beneath the tide. All the coordinates formed a rough spiral, converging here, on this fragment of land untouched by modern excavation. The team disembarked at nightfall. The shore was littered with pumice, light as bone. Underfoot, it gave the sense of walking on memory, fragile, hollow, ancient. The air smelled faintly metallic. The scent of iron cooled too fast. They followed the alignment inland, their lamps trembling over fractured basalt, until they reached the base of a low plateau. There, half buried in ash, stood what at first seemed like a doorway. A slab of obsidian 2 meters high rose from a foundation of limestone. Its surface was flawless, not carved, not polished, but melted smooth, as if born of fire and arrested mid-liquid. When Ilara shone her light across it, the beam vanished. No reflection returned. The obsidian drank it whole. The others gathered close, expecting to see their silhouettes faintly mirrored. There was nothing, no image, no distortion. Only darkness so complete that it felt spatial, alive. The mirror refused to acknowledge the living. Alara raised her palm and held it an inch from the surface. The air felt colder there. A vibration passed faintly through her glove. Not sound but pressure, like the breath before speech. She asked for a spectrometer reading. The surface registered a faint electromagnetic field, oscillating in intervals. Not random, but rhythmic. It was the same pattern recorded at the site of the resonant stone. A pulse like a distant heartbeat, patient and deep. When the ascent begins and the safety stop holds the divers at 5 meters, the sea stares back like an old lens. Bubbles wander upward and break with sounds that barely reach human ears. On the boat, notes are transcribed while the details still hover intact. The way sunlight made a moving net across the court at noon. The way a red starfish sat like a seal on a fragment of molding. The way everyone was quiet without being told. A journal entry, private, allows a different vocabulary. Ash, breath, ring, memory, echo, stillness. The hand pauses above the page because accuracy is a duty, but so is wonder, and sometimes the two are the same work seen from different depths. By daybreak, they cleared the ash around the base and uncovered fragments of inscription etched into the limestone frame. The symbols were partially legible, linear A, mingled with later Hellenic letters. The words read, Eidolon Anelthan, Nemi Katabinii. When the image ascends, the memory descends. Alara's translator frowned. A riddle, he said. She shook her head. An equation. The team established a perimeter, setting up infrared scanners and shallow seismic probes. Beneath the slab, the readings showed a hollow, a chamber perhaps 4 meters deep. The mirror was not a monument. It was a seal. When the sun reached its zenith, they observed something remarkable. The obsidian began to shimmer, not reflecting light, but refracting it inward, as though the heat awoke something beneath the surface. The darkness rippled faintly, distorting the air around it. No temperature change registered, yet the skin prickled. One of the divers murmured that he saw movement. A shadow within the black, bending, turning, almost human in outline. Then it was gone. Alara approached again, slower this time. She spoke softly, without expectation. You've kept something, she said. Her reflection did not answer, but the field monitors registered a pulse. One single flare, then silence. That evening, they lowered a fiber-optic camera through a narrow fissure beside the slab. The feed returned an image of a small chamber below, walls lined with obsidian fragments, shards that caught no light. In the center, a low basin filled with seawater reflected nothing at all. But around its rim were tiny carvings. Eyes, hundreds of them, all closed. The chamber had been sealed for millennia, untouched since the Bronze Age. Carbon traces on the limestone suggested repeated exposure to intense heat. Perhaps a ritual fire, perhaps a volcanic vent intentionally harnessed. The obsidian mirror, Helena noted in her log, could only have formed in a temperature exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. Yet it bore no cracks. Whoever made it understood control over chaos, a mastery both scientific and sacred. By the third night, the wind rose, and the waves began to hammer the shore. The island trembled faintly, a reminder of the volatile mantle beneath. Alara stayed on deck, watching lightning pass silently across the horizon. She thought of reflection, how every civilization builds mirrors not to see itself, but to hide behind the image it wants to believe. The mirror on Nimos reflected nothing because it was built by a people who had already seen too much. It refused light because it carried memory instead, the residue of vision so powerful it could burn through centuries. In the morning, the storm cleared. The team prepared to seal the site, leaving sensors in place to monitor the magnetic flux. Alara took one last look before boarding the skiff. The obsidian slab stood motionless, its surface blacker than night, absorbing the sky. For a moment, she thought she saw faint ripples move across it, like breath fogging glass. Then the wind shifted, and it was still again. Radiocarbon will give ranges. Petrography will point to quarries on islands that still sit above the waterline. A shard's cobalt will argue for a trade route. A fishbone lodged in a drain will speak of a season. There will be jealousies, debates about chronology versus synchronisms, the tug-of-war between dates derived from trees and dates derived from pots. Papers will be written with careful language that respects the line between hypothesis and hope. Yet in the small hours when the boat rocks gently and the hull ticks like cooling stone, a thought returns without asking permission. The city is not gone. Its arrangement persists, its courtyards still receive light through water, its thresholds still invite the body into a slower rhythm, and in that rhythm the mind becomes able to remember. In her final report she wrote, "It does not mirror, it remembers. Perhaps reflection was never meant for the eye, but for the silence that comes after seeing." As the Orphean II drifted away, the mirror vanished behind waves of sunlight. No reflection followed. Only the sea, ancient, unreadable, carrying within it the memory of a civilization that had learned to hide even from its own image. And somewhere below the waves, the mirror waited, refusing the light, keeping what it had once seen. The dunes of Santorini's southern coast are not made of ordinary sand. They shimmer faintly at dawn, pale gold under the rising sun, and when the wind moves across them, they seem to hum, a low, uncertain vibration that fades as quickly as it begins. For centuries, local fishermen have spoken of nights when the beach itself would ring, a deep, bell-like tone rising through the grains as though the island were remembering something beneath. Dr. Livia Cale had heard those stories as a child. Years later, as a geophysical archaeologist aboard the Orphean II, she returned to the same shoreline, now with instruments sensitive enough to test what had once been dismissed as folklore. Her mission: to study the acoustic anomalies reported after strong tremors near the buried caldera. What she found would become one of the most haunting discoveries of the expedition. The first readings came just before dawn. Vibrational spectrographs placed across the dunes registered faint oscillations, regular, harmonic, resonant. The frequencies clustered near 432 Hz, the tonal range associated with certain ancient ceremonial instruments. Yet no source could be identified. There were no air vents, no seismic movement, no wind tunnels. The sand, it seemed, was singing by itself. When the team began excavation near the center of the anomaly, the sand shifted strangely, collapsing inward like water parting around an invisible shape. Within hours, they uncovered fragments of bronze, curved and hollow, coated in green corrosion. Each fragment bore intricate etchings, spirals, waves, and repeating symbols resembling stylized ears. One piece revealed a small loop like a handle. A bell. Not one, but dozens emerged as they cleared the area. Bells of varying size, some small enough for a child's hand, others the height of a man's chest. They were buried upright, partially fused into a ring formation, as if arranged intentionally to encircle a central pit. Livia crouched among them, tracing the inscriptions, patterns echoing the same geometry found in the submerged observatory and the resonant monolith. These were not mere instruments. They were part of the same network, a system built to make the Earth itself vibrate. Tests showed that the metal was not ordinary bronze but an alloy of copper, tin, and volcanic glass, a compound capable of amplifying low frequencies. When struck with a tuning hammer, even after centuries, one of the bells released a faint tone that lingered in the air like breath trapped in stone. Perhaps a word like Atlantis only confuses the ear because it tries to be a straight line through a spiral. Perhaps the spiral is the truer shape, a path that circles and returns, never repeating, always recognizing. The divers will come back when the season turns, moving with the patience of those who know that a secret is not a possession but a relationship. The ocean will keep what the earth forgets, not out of malice, not out of mercy, but because memory, like salt, like stone, is a way of belonging. And in the breath between two waves, where sound loosens and the body grows light, a city waits, intact where it matters, folded in water, open to anyone who learns to listen without hurry. The archaeologists called the site the choir field. They worked in silence, careful not to disturb the arrangement. During one evening session, as the sun bled into the horizon, a gust of wind passed through the hollow mouths of the bells and filled the valley with a resonance so deep it seemed to move through bone. The sound wasn't loud, it was everywhere. Later that night, Livia recorded what the instruments captured. A series of tones rising and falling in intervals consistent with musical phrasing. When she overlaid the frequencies from all the bells, they formed a precise harmonic series, a pattern mirroring the ratio of orbital distances between the planets known to the ancients. The music of the spheres, transcribed into earth and metal. But the purpose, she realized, was not to be heard. It was to be felt. The ground beneath the bells carried the vibration farther than sound could travel. It pulsed faintly through the surrounding cliffs, into the sea, where hydrophones detected the same frequencies echoing miles away. The island was resonating like a single, living instrument. In her notes, Livia wrote, "They tuned the land itself, each bell a frequency, each tone a memory. They built harmony into geology." When she returned alone to the site on the final morning, the tide had crept closer, the edges of the excavation already half buried. She stood among the bells as the wind rose again. Sand drifted across the rims, whispering against bronze, and one by one, they began to hum, softly, sequentially, like voices greeting her from beneath the surface. She did not record it. She simply listened. The tones were imperfect, fractured, but together they formed a chord so gentle it felt like forgiveness. For a moment, the dunes seemed to breathe, and she imagined the island remembering the catastrophe that had once destroyed it. The eruption, the wave, the ash, and answering now not with silence, but with music. By dusk, the wind had erased the site entirely. The bells were hidden once more, their song sealed in the sand. Back aboard the Orpheon II, Livia wrote her final report in ink, her handwriting slow and steady. The earth stores its grief in sound. What we call silence is only a frequency below hearing. That night, as the ship drifted over calm waters, the sonar logs recorded a faint tone rising from the seafloor, 432 hertz, sustained for exactly 2 minutes, then fading into nothing. The crew said it was interference. Livia smiled and said nothing. At night, the island sleeps under the memory of its own destruction. The villages that cling to the caldera rim glitter like constellations, their lights trembling above the hollow where the sea swallowed the old volcano. In one of those lights, Dr. Ilara Merkos writes her report. The pages smell faintly of salt. The ink thickens when it dries. Each line begins as data, latitude, stratigraphic note, sample code, but inevitably drifts into reverie. How does one measure silence? How do you catalog an emotion older than your species? The bells beneath the sand had answered once more. Not for study, not for proof, but for remembrance. The island had sung its name into the deep, and the sea, as always, had listened. The first time they saw it, it didn't look like fire at all. It shimmered faintly along the basalt walls of a submerged trench, veins of light moving under the rock like something alive, something remembering how to burn. The Orpheon II's remote cameras captured the glow near the southern ridge of the Aegean fracture zone, at a depth of nearly 200 meters. The data suggested bioluminescence, yet the spectral readings told another story. This light came not from life, but from heat, ancient heat, still breathing through stone. Dr. Orion Karas led the descent that morning. A volcanologist by trade and a historian by temperament, he had spent decades tracing the invisible lines between geology and myth, the places where the Earth's wounds and humanity's legends overlap. He had come to believe that the Atlantean age ended not in flood, but in ignition, a civilization undone by the fire it worshipped. At depth, the water was still and dark. The divers moved in careful silence, guided by the faint pulse of blue ahead. The trench widened, and the source revealed itself. A field of fissures exhaling thin ribbons of vapor that glowed as they rose. The phenomenon was unlike any hydrothermal vent they'd seen. The temperature was mild, almost human, and the emissions carried no trace of sulfur. When Orion extended his thermometer probe, the readings remained steady, 36.4 degrees Celsius. Body temperature. He stared through his mask at the living fire beneath the rock and whispered through the comms, "It's not venting, it's remembering." Closer inspection showed that the luminous veins followed deliberate paths. They curved and branched in patterns nearly identical to vascular diagrams found in early Minoan medical carvings. Maps of blood and energy drawn long before anatomy was a science. The rock was alive in geometry if not in form. One of the divers, Dr. Halim, noticed symbols etched faintly along the fissures, spirals and parallel lines resembling those carved into the resonant monolith and the bells beneath the sand. The pattern repeated in perfect proportion, suggesting that whoever built the ancient Atlantean network had known of these volcanic arteries. They hadn't simply worshipped the fire, they had mapped it. Samples taken from the glowing stone revealed microscopic crystals of aragonite and a rare compound of cobalt and phosphorus, elements capable of emitting light when exposed to fluctuating magnetic fields. The readings showed such a field pulsing deep below the trench, synchronous with the planet's geomagnetic rhythm. The Earth itself was playing its own current like a slow chord, and the veins responded in resonance. Orion realized that these veins of fire might have been both a source of power and a sacred site. The ancients could have harnessed the natural magnetic discharge to illuminate temples, or perhaps to perform rituals of healing, the light of the planet's blood drawn to the surface. During the second dive, they followed the largest vein into a hollow chamber beneath the trench. Inside, the walls glowed brighter, blue turning to white, the rock breathing softly in waves. At the center stood an altar-shaped formation of fused basalt, its surface polished like glass. Embedded within it were faint imprints, the shapes of hands. Dozens of them, some small, some large. They seemed to reach upward from the stone, not carved but pressed, as if once living hands had laid themselves upon the molten surface before it cooled. She closes her eyes and hears again the water's pulse against her mask. It sounded almost like wine through reeds, almost like a language that forgot its grammar. Some divers speak of sound illusions caused by pressure, but she suspects there are other pressures, the weight of time, the density of belief, that produce their own kinds of hearing. No one spoke. The glow pulsed, and the chamber hummed in a tone barely audible through the comms. It was not threatening, it was intimate, steady, patient. The divers recorded the sound. A low harmonic resonating at 8.6 hertz, almost identical to the brain's alpha rhythm during waking dreams. Orion placed his hand over one of the imprints. The rock was warm, the warmth neither rising nor falling. For a moment he felt a vibration. Not sound, but something internal, a whisper inside the bones. He closed his eyes, and behind the darkness he saw movement. Light weaving through stone, through memory, through time. He saw the outline of cities built along glowing rivers of fire, towers lit from beneath, streets breathing with blue energy. He saw them vanish. Not destroyed, but absorbed, the light returning to the veins below. He opened his eyes. The others were staring at him silently. None of them asked what he'd seen. When they surfaced, the water above the trench shimmered faintly, as though the glow below had followed them upward. Orion stood on deck long after the others had gone below. The sea was black, but at its edges, a soft electric blue traced the waves, sketching unseen constellations on the surface. In his log that night, he wrote, "If the earth remembers in heat what the sea remembers in silence, then Atlantis was never lost. It simply retreated into the bloodstream of the world." Before dawn, the glow beneath the ship faded, but the sensors continued to record a pulse deep within the crust. Constant, rhythmic, alive. The team called it geothermal interference. Orion called it heartbeat. He never dove again, but years later, he would still wake sometimes with blue light flickering behind his eyes, as though something in the depths had marked him. A memory, a frequency, a breath of fire still wandering beneath the skin of the world. The caldera of Santorini is not merely a scar. It is an opening, a wound that never quite closed. From the air it looks serene, a crescent of cliffs encircling a sea of blue, but from beneath, its shape tells another story. The geometry of collapse, the architecture of absence. The Orphean II drifted at its center on a windless morning, its hull perfectly still above the drowned heart of an island that had once glowed brighter than any in the Aegean. Dr. Amara Voss and Dr. Elias Varin stood together at the railing, watching the ripples trace slow circles across the caldera. This was where it had begun or ended. The expedition's data, gathered over months, all converged here. The resonant stone, the drowned observatory, the library, the mirror, the bells, the veins of blue fire. Every signal, every frequency, pointed inward, toward this vast, silent gate of sea and memory. From the deck, she watches a buoy flash on the dark horizon. Beneath it, the drowned plaza lies in absolute night, yet its geometry persists, the alignment of foundations, the subtle orientation to the solstice. Even underwater, the builders had anticipated light, shaping their city not against darkness but within it. The divers descended just after dawn. The water shimmered with volcanic silt, turning the light into liquid glass. At 50 meters, the slope revealed a corridor of basalt columns descending into the deep, too symmetrical to be natural, too fractured to still be whole. Their submersible followed the formation until the cameras caught a dark void at its base. A perfect oval carved into the rock, 10 meters high, framed by two standing pillars of obsidian. It was the gate. Around it, the seabed was littered with debris, shards of pottery fused with glass, fragments of carved relief showing figures holding vessels of flame. Many of the shards bore traces of mica and gold, materials used in Minoan ritual inlays. The images depicted a procession, not fleeing, not worshipping, but walking calmly toward the opening, carrying light into darkness. Inside the gate, the current changed. The water became heavier, colder, filled with suspended ash. The submersible's lights illuminated the tunnel ahead. Not a natural cave, but an engineered passage, its walls lined with fused volcanic glass that mirrored nothing. When the sonar pinged, the echoes did not return. It was as though the sound itself was being swallowed. Amara adjusted her headset. "We're inside an absorber," she murmured. "Something built to silence." Elias nodded beside her. His instruments recorded faint vibrations along the walls. Rhythmic, slow, similar to those detected in the bells beneath the sand. The frequency matched 8.6 Hz, the same resonance found in the veins of blue fire. Whatever this place was, it had been tuned. They drifted deeper. The tunnel widened into a chamber. On the floor lay a ring of fallen columns arranged in a spiral, their surfaces carved with alternating symbols: water, fire, and breath. In the center rose a pedestal, simple, unadorned, half buried in ash, and resting on it, covered by mineral dust and coral, a disk of volcanic glass, black, circular, and still intact. Amara brushed the sediment away with her gloved hand. The disk revealed a map etched so finely it could only be seen when light struck at an angle. She recognized the pattern instantly, the same spiral geometry found in every site they had uncovered. Each spoke connected to one of the discovered locations. And at the center, the symbol of an eye. Elias whispered, "It's not a gate to somewhere else. It's a gate between, a convergence." The light from their submersible dimmed suddenly. The readings spiked. A low tone began to hum through the chamber. Not mechanical, but deep, organic, rising from the stone itself. The spiral on the disk shimmered faintly, lines glowing with the same blue as the veins of fire. For a moment, the entire chamber pulsed in rhythm with the sea outside. Later, she will send samples to Athens. Fragments of volcanic glass, traces of tin oxide, a sliver of calcite carved too cleanly to be coincidence. Analysts will produce graphs and tables. They will mark the probable period. Late Bronze Age, between 1650 and 1500 BCE. They will debate influences, Cycladic, Minoan, something unclassified. Someone will suggest a ceremonial harbor complex. Someone else will dismiss it as geological mimicry. But for Alara, the truth lives in the weightless moment when she hovered above that plaza and felt time fold inward, like the closing of a shell. The divers froze. Amara felt the vibration move through her chest. Steady, patient, neither hostile nor welcoming. It was recognition. The gate was not opening. It was remembering them back. Outside, the Orphean 2 sensors registered the same pulse radiating outward from the caldera in concentric rings. a silent wave moving across the Aegean like breath expanding through stone. The sea stayed calm, but the instruments trembled. Then, as suddenly as it began, the hum ceased. The light faded. The gate returned to stillness. When the divers surfaced, the morning had turned glassy and pale. The horizon seemed farther than before, the air thinner, as if the world had briefly inhaled and was now holding its breath. On deck, Amara placed the recovered disc on a cloth beside her instruments. Under sunlight, it appeared opaque. But when she tilted it, faint etchings glowed through, lines connecting every known Atlantean site, converging here, in the heart of Thera. Elias looked at her and asked, almost whispering, "What do you think it was?" She answered softly, "A memory device, but not for people, for the earth itself. A gate that remembers the energy that once passed through it." He nodded slowly. So the myths were right in a way. Atlantis didn't fall. It folded inward. She smiled faintly. Maybe it was never a place to begin with. Maybe it was a pulse. That evening, as the Orphean II left the caldera, the water around the ship shimmered faintly blue. Not reflection, but luminescence, faint as breath. The waves moved without sound. Each discovery changes the present a little. The world becomes slightly quieter after such revelations, as though reality needs a pause to absorb what it has remembered. She feels it now, the earth breathing through the waves, the echo of a civilization that did not entirely die but rearranged itself into myth. The map of the Mediterranean is full of such rearrangements. Troy beneath Hizarlik, Pavlopetri beneath the Peloponnese, Heracleon beneath the Nile Delta. Every rediscovery adds another layer to the sentence that began millennia ago. Atlantis, perhaps, was never a single city, but a pattern, a way the sea writes its memory upon us. In her journal, Amara wrote the final entry of the expedition. The gate does not open outward, it listens inward. Some doors were never meant to be crossed, only remembered. The sea swallowed the light of the setting sun, calm and endless. Beneath it, the gate of Thera waited, patient as stone, still listening for the echoes of a civilization that had once spoken to the planet in the language of resonance. They found it by accident. A faint shimmer caught in the black sediment at the edge of the caldera, something too precise to be mineral, too patient to be man-made. When the divers cleared the sand away, a structure emerged. A narrow column of translucent stone rising from the seabed like frozen lightning. It pulsed faintly, a rhythm just slow enough to be missed if one blinked. Dr. Nadir Solin called it the lumen column, though later in her notes she wrote another name beside it, the light that forgot the sky. Under ultraviolet scan, the column revealed veins of trapped luminescence running through its core, filaments that responded to touch and magnetic flux, glowing faintly blue-white before dimming again. Its outer layer was composed of fused silicate and quartz, the inner core an unknown crystalline structure resembling both obsidian and ice. When struck lightly with a tuning rod, it resonated, not in air, but in the water around it, sending out concentric ripples like silent bells. Nadir compared its pattern to data from the Gate of Thera. The frequencies matched. Every resonance, every harmonic, folded into the same 8.6 Hz pulse that had haunted their recordings since the beginning. The light, it seemed, belonged to the same network, not electrical but mnemonic. A memory system built not of circuits but of resonance, storing knowledge in vibration. The column stood alone, yet the sediment around it showed traces of a ring foundation, suggesting it had once been part of a larger array. Perhaps a beacon, perhaps an instrument of synchronization, or something far older, something that remembered illumination itself. She thought of the legends describing how Atlantis fell beneath a sky of light. Not fire, not storm, but illumination. A brilliance so immense that it turned night to day before the sea swallowed it whole. What if that light had not been extinguished but absorbed? What if it had retreated into the earth, crystallizing into structures like this one, waiting millennia to be found? When Nadir brushed her gloved hand against the surface, the column responded. A pulse like a heartbeat, faint and immediate. The glow spread outward along the veins, then faded again, leaving a faint afterimage on the water. The instruments went silent for a moment, as if time itself had held its breath. The stars drift west, the night folds, the instruments sleep in their cases, and still the water moves with the same slow grammar. Later, in the laboratory, she analyzed the resonance logs. The light pattern translated into a waveform resembling human speech frequencies, but too slow to be perceived as sound. When sped up, the data produced a tone that oscillated like a human voice repeating a single syllable. The word was not clear, but the waveform formed a near-perfect spiral. She wrote in her journal that night, "It is not communication, it is remembrance, the physical memory of illumination, seeking the sky it once touched." The following evening, she returned to the site alone in a one-person submersible. The sea was calm, the trench below completely dark. When her lights reached the column, it glowed before she touched it, faintly at first, then brighter, as if recognizing her return. It did not hum this time, it breathed. The water around it shimmered, the sand lifted slightly from the seafloor, and Nadir felt the same warmth that the volcanologists had described beneath the veins of blue fire, the steady, living heat of the Earth's pulse. She closed her eyes, and the glow flickered behind them like memory. She saw not cities or temples, but an image of light itself breaking apart, fragmenting, scattering into matter, into water, into memory. And within that dissolution, a strange peace. The idea that nothing sacred is ever lost, only translated. When she surfaced, the stars were reflected perfectly in the still water, so perfectly that the boundary between sea and sky vanished. For a moment she could not tell which world she was returning to. In her final field note, she wrote, "The column does not shine, it remembers shining. The sea keeps what the sky forgets." At dawn, the Orphean II prepared to depart the caldera. As the engines turned, the sonar captured one last resonance from below, a low, luminous hum, half sound, half silence. It faded slowly into stillness, as though the light had finally remembered where it came from. Alara touches the railing and whispers to herself, though no one hears. The sea does not hide, it remembers in another language. And beneath the calm, endless blue, the column remained, glowing faintly in the dark, a memory of the sky, still waiting for dawn. By the time the Orphean II reached the open sea beyond Thera, the crew had fallen silent. The ocean stretched endlessly, a mirror of pale gray light, its surface so calm it seemed not to move at all. Dr. Amara Voss remained on deck long after sunset, the recovered samples secured below. Fragments of obsidian, glowing sand, the black disk from the gate, and the thin slivers of blue crystal still faintly pulsing in their containment vials. Each piece hummed with the same quiet rhythm. Each belonged to something larger, something that breathed through the planet itself. The next morning, the instruments registered a global anomaly. Across multiple seismic arrays, from Crete to the Azores, identical microvibrations appeared. A low-frequency oscillation moving through the crust, circling the world in precisely 8 hours. No fault line matched it, no storm could explain it. It was as if the Earth were sighing in its sleep. Amara watched the data scroll across the monitors. The pulse matched the frequency of the Atlantean resonance they had traced from the beginning. The same rhythm that linked the bells, the mirror, the veins of fire, the gate, the light. It was everywhere now, beneath them, beneath every continent. At first, she thought it coincidence. But then the readings shifted again, pulsing with greater clarity, as if responding to their discovery. The planet was echoing back. Later that day, Elias joined her on deck. The sea was motionless, its horizon dissolved into cloud. "You hear it too," he said softly. She nodded. There was no sound, not truly, yet something pressed faintly against the inner ear. A vibration low and deep, like distant thunder turned inward. "The continents," Elias murmured. "They're moving again, not drifting, breathing." Amara smiled faintly. Maybe they never stopped. She recalled ancient myths describing the world as a living being, the continents its bones, the oceans its blood, the mountains its breath. For centuries, science had stripped that language away, but now, watching the pulse on the monitors, it felt truer than ever. Something vast and ancient was stirring, not violently, but slowly, like a sleeper turning in a dream. The seismic patterns showed that the pulse moved not along tectonic lines but through resonance paths, the same geometric spirals carved into Atlantean artifacts. The patterns connected continents that had once been joined, Africa to South America, Europe to the Caribbean, the Aegean to the Atlantic Ridge. The ocean floor itself seemed to shimmer faintly, the instruments detecting subtle electromagnetic changes. Somewhere below, the statues wait. Their marble eyelids do not blink. The salt preserves their calm. Perhaps they were never meant to be seen again. Perhaps discovery is only another form of remembering. At night, the bioluminescent plankton surrounding the ship began to glow in concentric rings, moving in rhythm with the unseen vibration. The entire surface of the sea pulsed like a heartbeat made of light. The crew watched in silence. Some recorded, others simply stood still. Amara whispered, "It's the same pulse that started the myth." Elias nodded. "And the same one that will end it." She looked out across the illuminated expanse. The world seemed to hum, softly, patiently, not as a warning, but as remembrance. The continents, once torn apart by fire and tide, were dreaming of reunion, their buried memories resonating through stone and salt. In her notebook she wrote, "Perhaps Atlantis was never destroyed. Perhaps it dispersed, its energy carried by the very continents that rose from its bones. What we call continents are only fragments of a sleeping world, still turning in its ancient rhythm." At dawn, the light over the horizon trembled in the mist, golden and fragile. The hum had softened, fading into something like silence, though the sensors still detected faint rhythmic tremors deep beneath the crust. An eternal breathing. The Orphean II continued west, its wake tracing slow silver lines behind it. The sea was calm, the sky pale. Amara felt as if the world had grown weightless, suspended between pulse and stillness. She thought of all they had found: the outpost, the observatory, the mirror, the bells, the veins, the gate, the light, each a fragment of a vast memory written into the architecture of the earth. As the ship crossed into open Atlantic waters, she closed her eyes. For a moment, she felt it. The faint rhythm, the deep thrum beneath everything, older than language, older than the continents themselves. It was not Atlantis calling to them. It was the planet remembering itself. When dawn arrives, the horizon blooms in muted rose. The light finds its reflection on the calm water. A luminous breath, a hint of gold spreading like a pulse through the tide. Beneath it lies a plaza of stone that has outlasted empires, and within that stone, a silence that has learned to hum. And in that remembrance, there was no sound, only stillness. The long, slow breathing of the world asleep beneath its oceans. Night fell over the Aegean like a slow breath. The Orphean II drifted without engine, its lights dimmed to preserve the silence of the water. Around it, the sea was glass, so still that stars trembled upon its surface as if uncertain where the sky ended and reflection began. No wind, no sound, only the faint pulse beneath, the same deep rhythm that had followed them from the ruins, from the gates, from the light. Dr. Amara Voss stood alone on deck. In her hands, the last fragment, a shard of volcanic glass no larger than a coin, carved with the spiral that had haunted every discovery. It glimmered faintly in the dark, reflecting neither sky nor sea, but something quieter, the shimmer of distance, the memory of a world that had once spoken through stone. She thought of the others, Elara, Orion, Nadir, Elias, each drawn into the same undercurrent of memory. They had not uncovered a civilization. They had uncovered continuity. Atlantis was not a city drowned by the sea. It was the sea, the planet itself remembering its youth through mineral and resonance. The tide shifted then, so softly that it was almost imperceptible. The water near the hull thickened, darkened, and began to glow, the same deep blue light that had guided them through every descent. It rose in slow spirals around the ship, luminous threads twining upward, vanishing as they touched the air. The sea was breathing. Amara knelt, touched the surface. The water was warm, alive with tiny motes of light, the ocean's handwriting. It pulsed in patterns, not random but rhythmic, the faint suggestion of speech too vast to be translated. "The tide remembers," she whispered. The sensors confirmed it moments later, the global pulse returning once more, spreading outward from Thera, crossing the Mediterranean, moving along the oceanic ridges like a song retracing its own echo. It would fade soon, as it always did, leaving only data and silence. Yet somewhere deep beneath the crust, the memory would remain, dreaming through pressure and fire. She rose and turned toward the horizon. The east was beginning to pale. The first light of dawn touched the rim of the caldera. Soft, fragile, ancient. The air smelled faintly of salt and ash. Amara thought of the map carved into the black disk. A spiral of memory folding inward, not to end, but to begin again. Perhaps that was the secret the ancients had known. That civilizations do not vanish, they submerge into time, their voices turning into minerals, their ideas into magnetic fields, their prayers into the hum of the planet. The ocean keeps what the earth forgets, and within that keeping, the story continues, not in words or records, but in the slow exhalation of waves that once moved through streets now hidden, the breath of a city that dreamed itself into the sea and found, there, a quieter kind of eternity. The tide reached her boots, lapping once against the deck before receding. In that brief contact, she felt it. The same warmth that pulsed in the veins of blue fire, the same frequency that echoed through the bells, the same silence that lay beneath the mirror. Everything they had found was one breath, scattered across ages, returning now in a single exhale. In her final entry she wrote, "The ocean does not forget. It waits until we are quiet enough to hear it again." Every civilization sinks not into death, but into sleep, waiting for the tide to bring its name back to the shore. The sun broke the horizon. Light spilled across the deck, flooding the black glass in her hand. For a heartbeat, the fragment flared with blue, then turned clear, as if releasing the last of its memory. The engines started. The ship began its slow turn toward home. Behind them, the Aegean shimmered, endless, silent, breathing. And somewhere beneath its calm surface, the tide was already returning, carrying with it the dreams of a world that never truly disappeared. Rain whispered against the broken windows of an old monastery perched above the Anatolian plain. Within, the library lay half asleep, a chamber of dust and candlelight, where air moved like breath through centuries of neglect. Wooden shelves leaned like old monks at prayer, their bindings flaking into quiet constellations of age. At the far table sat Dr. Leandros Hale, a historical cartographer known less for discovery than for patience, the kind of patience that waits decades for a single map to speak. He had come here to examine a scroll unearthed during restoration of the monastery's crypt. The artifact had no provenance, only rumor. Local workers claimed it hummed faintly when handled, though the vibration was never recorded by instrument. It was catalogued as anomalous chart, 14th to 16th century, material uncertain. But under the first sweep of light, Leandros knew it was older, centuries older. Perhaps copied, perhaps dreamed from something even further back. The parchment itself felt different beneath his gloves. Not vellum, not papyrus. The texture seemed almost mineral, a membrane formed between writing and memory. Its pigment shimmered faintly, neither ink nor dye, but a substance made of crushed lapis, carbon soot, and something unidentifiable that refracted light like mica dust. The lines did not describe terrain, no mountains, no rivers, no coastlines. Instead, spirals and lattices filled the field, intersected by faint circles that suggested celestial movement. Around the margins, tiny letters formed hymnal notations, half Greek, half something older, perhaps linear as stylized into monkish hand. He adjusted his magnifier. Beneath the pigments, he noticed microabrasions, evidence of rewriting. The parchment had lived several lives. Each new scribe had layered meaning over the last until the surface itself became an archaeology of intent. He felt the echo of those who had copied in candlelight before him. Monks tracing lines without understanding, preserving something sacred yet incomprehensible. Outside, thunder moved across the plain. Inside, The candle wavered, and the map seemed to shimmer, as though each vibration in the air stirred its ink. He leaned closer. There was no scale, no compass rose. Yet, in the center of the chart, faint burnishing marked a spiral path that tightened inward until it vanished into a single dot. Not an endpoint, but an aperture. A gate. He recognized the pattern. In the ruins of Knossos and Phaistos, similar spirals had been carved into stone discs, their purpose still debated: calendars, prayers, or tools for navigating memory. The motif appeared also in Egyptian temple ceilings, aligned to star maps of Sirius and Orion. In the Mayan codices, it was the shape of the breath, the spiral exhalation through which gods formed worlds. The symbol had traveled without ships, carried by something older than language. He cross-referenced the coordinates by overlaying digital tracings, feeding them through his mapping software. The result was absurd. When projected upon the globe, the spiral intersected major archaeological sites: Thera, Giza, Malta, Tiwanaku, points arranged not by geography but by resonance. Each site represented a threshold, a conversation between heaven and earth. And in the very center of the spiral, where the map's ink vanished into silence, lay the mid-Atlantic ridge. He stopped the projection and simply stared. It was an impossible alignment, yet the numbers were exact. Could the chart be an ancient attempt at mapping something beneath the oceanic crust? A myth translated into geometry? Or a memory encoded before catastrophe? Leandros leaned back, letting the thought dissolve. In archaeology, certainty is a form of blindness. The deeper truths rarely declare themselves. They wait for listening, not for logic. He turned the lamp low, tracing the outer rim of the spiral with a gloved fingertip. The surface seemed almost warm, faintly responsive, as if some mineral within the pigment retained static energy. The hum returned, soft as breath. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he imagined the scribe, perhaps a monk, perhaps something older, hunched over this same parchment centuries ago, guided by a light not from flame but from remembrance. The lines had not been drawn to show direction. They had been sung, each curve a tone, each spiral a chord. The map was less a drawing than an echo frozen into pigment, a musical geometry of a place not yet lost. When he reopened his eyes, the candlelight seemed altered. The ink reflected in dull gold rather than blue. The faint letters along the margin, once indecipherable, now appeared to shift, not meaning exactly, but cadence. He copied them carefully. "Non itinera," said Memoria. "Not a path, but a memory." He whispered the phrase aloud. The room absorbed it like water. For hours he remained there, charting correspondences. The way the spirals mirrored the architecture of labyrinths, the way ancient sanctuaries aligned to solstice stars. Across civilizations separated by oceans, the same geometry emerged, as if humanity were collectively remembering something that had once existed and then vanished beneath myth. When dawn came, pale and unhurried, he realized he had stopped thinking in maps altogether. The parchment on the table no longer felt like an artifact. It felt like presence, a mirror reflecting not places, but consciousness itself. He thought of how the ocean floor holds ridges shaped like thought, how magma hardens into curves that echo the brain's own gyri. Perhaps the ancients had seen this correspondence and called it sacred. Perhaps Atlantis, whatever name it wore, was never a city, but a memory of equilibrium between mind and world. In his report, he would record composition, scale, pigment ratios, the language of science. But in his notebook, he wrote a single line: "The map does not point to land, but to the remembrance of light." He packed the parchment carefully, sealing it within protective glass. Yet even encased, it seemed to breathe faintly, a vibration one could feel through fingertips if the air was still enough. As he left the library, dawn spilled through broken windows, touching the table where the map had lain. For an instant, the remaining dust formed a spiral, the same pattern vanishing as light moved. That evening, aboard the train bound for Athens, he sat by the window watching clouds drift over the horizon. The hum followed him still, faint but constant, as though the map had imprinted itself upon his pulse. He thought of the old monasteries built over older ruins, of the way knowledge reuses the stones of its own forgetting. Every discovery begins with a question, but some questions are not meant to end. They circle, they spiral, they return. Outside, the last light sank into the horizon. The glass caught his reflection, and behind it, for just a moment, the faint outline of the spiral appeared again, hovering like a memory that refuses erasure. Perhaps maps were never meant to guide us outward, he thought, but home. The hum faded with the twilight, leaving behind only the sound of the train, rhythmic and eternal, carrying him deeper into the unknown, toward the center of a memory that had dreamed him first. The descent began at twilight, when the sea took on the color of bruised glass. The expedition ship, Orpheon II, floated 50 nautical miles south of Crete, above a trench where sonar had mapped what seemed like a perfect dome, smooth, metallic, and too symmetrical to be chance. The coordinates lay near the Hellenic Arc, a region geologically restless, carved by tectonic memory and ancient fear. It was here that the Minoan seafarers once charted the heavens, not with telescopes, but with mirrors of water and flame. Dr. Amara Voss, marine archaeologist, watched the waves flatten as the sun sank. Her dive suit was heavy with sensors and quiet expectation. The mission log called the site substructure E4, but among the crew it was already known by another name, the Drowned Observatory. The discovery came after magnetometer scans showed faint anomalies beneath the silt. A circle of bronze plates fused to basalt, and under them, an empty chamber sealed by time. The water that greeted them was dense with twilight. Descending, the divers saw fragments of light slipping through plankton like falling stars. At 40 meters, the beam of a submersible caught the first arc of the dome, a surface polished as though recently touched by fire. Barnacles formed constellations across its curve. As they circled lower, more details emerged. Radial struts, bronze filigree, and a collapsed aperture at the summit. It was unmistakably crafted. Inside, the chamber opened like a lung. A corroded mechanism hung in its center, an armillary of rings, each carved with zodiacal symbols, suspended in silence. The team illuminated it with low-intensity lamps. Every motion stirred sediment that rose like smoke. The device resembled the Antikythera mechanism but magnified 100-fold. Gears interlocked with crystalline discs, each one etched with trajectories of stars long vanished from the modern sky. Amara hovered beside it, noting the engraving along the base, linear characters interspersed with geometric intervals.
One fragment read taf physigman apnei. The light breathes.
She whispered it into her calm, though no one replied. Her voice felt out of place here. Around the mechanism stood lanterns, bronze frames with glass still intact, encrusted yet unbroken. When a beam of light passed through one, the entire chamber shimmered with refraction, scattering soft auroras across the walls. The air pockets inside had preserved something invisible yet potent, a memory of flame. Later analysis would confirm that these lanterns contained residues of calcium carbonate and traces of magnesium. The composition of Therakos, the ancient volcanic glass the Minoans once ground into lamps for ritual astronomy. Such lamps, historians believe, were used not merely for light but for alignment. Their glow tuned to mimic starlight during observations. The builders of this observatory had literally brought the heavens beneath the sea. Amara's pulse slowed. She realized the design of the dome mirrored constellations above, each strut aligned to a star that had already died. The architecture was a memorial to celestial disappearance, a mausoleum for light. She switched off her lamp. For a moment, darkness reclaimed the chamber. Then something unexpected happened. Faint luminescence rose from the walls, not artificial, not bioluminescent. A slow shimmer born from minerals saturated with trapped energy. Pulsed like a heartbeat, the divers hovered, wordless. The instruments registered nothing. The sea outside pressed in, miles of pressure muting everything human. In that hush, Amara felt a presence. Not alive, not dead, but attentive. Perhaps the lanterns still functioned in another way. Their glass panes, fused with metallic salts, had become vessels of stored radiation, relics of volcanic ages when sunlight entered rock and never fully escaped. When disturbed, they remembered light. She approached one and brushed away sediment with her gloved hand. For an instant, the pane flared gold, a reflection or an answer. The observation dome was mapped in detail over 3 days. LiDAR scans showed a precision of alignment accurate to within seconds of celestial arc. Its builders had known precession, the slow dance of the stars across millennia. Such knowledge belonged to astronomers of the Bronze Age, yet the structure predated known observatories by centuries. Radiocarbon tests from organic residue on the lantern frames suggested 1700 BCE. When they resurfaced, the team spoke in quiet fragments. Part data, part disbelief. The surface world felt too bright. That night, Amara sat alone on the deck, reviewing footage. The slow rotation of the dome, the gentle shimmer of dormant lamps, the faint hum recorded by hydrophones, a frequency just below hearing, resonating at 8 Hz, close to the rhythm of the human brain at rest. She thought of ancient astronomers watching the heavens from this place, timing their chants to the breathing of the planet. She imagined them descending into the chamber, lighting their magnesium lamps, watching constellations bloom across the curved ceiling like reflections in a sacred mirror. When the eruption of Thera came, it must have flooded everything in an instant. Fire met water, light was buried alive, and yet, even submerged, it continued to shine, invisibly, faithfully. In the early morning, before the next dive, she wrote a line in her notebook. They did not build to observe the stars. They built to keep them from forgetting us. She closed the journal and listened to the waves. The sea was calm, the horizon colorless. Somewhere below, in the slow pulse of the drowned observatory, the lanterns still dreamed, not of the heavens above, but of the light that once rose from human hands to meet them. Perhaps all observatories end this way, submerged not in water, but in time, their purpose fulfilled when the stars they measured finally vanish, and only their echo remains in the dark. And when night came again, Amara thought she saw, deep beneath the surface, a faint halo glimmering through the water, as if the lanterns had awakened, remembering the sky. The discovery came by accident, as many do, a misread coordinate, a drift in current, a team of surveyors searching the Aegean shelf for amphora fields but finding instead a lone shape half buried in sand. At first glance, it was only a block of basalt, dark and unyielding, the kind often mistaken for geological noise. But when the submersible's lights struck it, the surface shimmered with a faint resonance, as if the rock itself had just exhaled. Dr. Elias Varin, an acoustical archaeologist, had joined the Orphean II team for the second leg of their Atlantis sequence, a continuation of their underwater studies around the volcanic arc between Santorini and Crete. His specialty was ancient sound, the architecture of voice in temples, the physics of echo in ritual sites. When he heard that a singing stone had been logged at depth, he requested an immediate descent. The dive began before dawn. The water was cold and thick with suspended minerals, glowing faintly under the submersible's floodlights. At 70 meters, the object appeared again. Not basalt, as the first survey had suggested, but a sculpted monolith. Smooth on one face, fractured on the other, and etched with shallow symbols spiraling inward like a wave caught in stone. The divers approached in silence. Elias pressed a gloved hand to the monolith and felt a faint vibration. Rhythmic, low, nearly organic. He signaled for recording. The hydrophones registered a frequency between 15 and 20 Hz, below human hearing but strong enough to make the chest tremble. It was not random. It pulsed in intervals, like a slow heart or an ancient chant too vast for breath. When light struck the carvings at a shallow angle, their pattern became clear. Repeating arcs, intersecting circles, and a single elongated shape resembling a mouth. Around it, waves radiated outward, carved with such precision that the spacing matched modern acoustic wavelengths. This was not ornament. It was design. Elias felt the old thrill of recognition, the quiet certainty that someone long ago had understood resonance not as phenomenon but as language. In his studies of early Hellenic sanctuaries, he had measured walls tuned to human voice, the tholos of Delphi, the domes of Knossos, the later amphitheaters of Epidaurus, all magnified speech to impossible clarity. But this stone was older, its simplicity deliberate, its function pure. He positioned the recording instruments and began emitting controlled sound pulses. The echo that returned was haunting. Unlike any reflection he had measured, it came back harmonically shifted. The tone changed, refined, as if the stone itself were answering in a lower octave. The data confirmed it. The monolith amplified certain frequencies while absorbing others, producing a modulated resonance that could have carried across vast distances underwater. Later, laboratory analysis of the stone fragments revealed traces of crystalline calcite fused with iron. When excited by sound, such minerals can vibrate for prolonged periods, piezoelectric memory, the same principle used in quartz instruments. The singing stone was, in effect, a primitive resonator, an archive not of symbols, but of vibration. The question was, what sound had it kept? Over the next days, the team mapped the seabed around the monolith. They found smaller stones placed in a circular pattern, as though once part of a structure, perhaps a sanctuary, perhaps an underwater extension of a temple lost to the eruption. Sediment samples suggested the area had been dry before the Thera explosion. Radiocarbon from trapped organic remains dated the layer to 1600 BCE, consistent with the age of Atlantis destruction in legend. At night, Elias replayed the recordings in the ship's lab. The low hum filled the room, gentle yet commanding. Through equalization he began to isolate overtone patterns, and slowly shapes formed, harmonics corresponding to the human vocal range, modulated by water. Someone, thousands of years ago, had carved a stone to remember a voice. He imagined the scene. A priest or singer standing before the stone, chanting toward it, letting sound engrave itself into the mineral lattice. The rock, built to capture that vibration, would retain the frequency long after the speaker was gone. It was not an altar. It was an archive, a record made not with ink, but with resonance. By the third night, fatigue blurred the line between analysis and trance. The hum had become familiar, almost conversational. Elias noticed patterns repeating at intervals of 12 minutes, as if the signal cycled through phrases. He amplified one section slightly, and a ripple of overtones filled the air. It was not speech, not melody, but something between. He felt the ship's metal frame tremble slightly in sympathy. The others slept. Only the quiet machinery of the Orphean II kept rhythm with the sound. He sat alone before the waveform display, watching its slow oscillations. The longer he listened, the more he sensed intention, a cadence too deliberate to be coincidence. At dawn, he returned to the monolith for one last dive. The sea was still. Shafts of sunlight pierced the water like slow arrows. As he approached the site, he felt again that vibration, stronger now, as if the stone had been waiting. He released a sound pulse, and the echo returned layered, harmonic, almost human. Then, for a single second, he heard it. A voice, distant but distinct. One syllable drawn across the water, ancient and soft. The instruments failed to capture it, but he was sure. Not hallucination, recognition. When he surfaced, the others saw the look in his eyes and did not ask. Some discoveries cannot be proven. They can only be felt. That evening, as the ship turned toward the Santorini caldera, Elias stood on deck with his recorder in hand. The sea was quiet, the sky a muted blue. He pressed play. The low hum unfolded again. Patient, endless, breathing. He wrote his final entry before sleep. It does not speak in words, only in vibration. Perhaps all voices become this, a frequency that the world remembers long after we forget the sound of ourselves. The ocean rocked the ship in long, slow rhythm. Below, in the dark, the monolith kept singing, steady and infinite, carrying a voice that had crossed 4,000 years of silence just to be heard again. The sea opened like a slow breath along the cliffs of eastern Crete, where the limestone had been hollowed by centuries of tide. From above, the entrance to the cavern looked like nothing, a wound in the rock half hidden by foam. But beneath the surface, divers found the faint geometry of intent. Steps carved into stone, descending into a corridor that no storm could have shaped. The walls bore parallel grooves, evenly spaced, as though hands had once touched them in passing, again and again, until memory became architecture. Dr. Helena Ardent led the descent. A historian of maritime archives, she had studied the Minoan use of clay tablets and wax seals, their obsession with cataloging the invisible. What drew her here was a legend written on a fragment from Phaistos, a broken tablet referring to the house where the tide keeps records. Scholars dismissed it as metaphor, but metaphors, she often said, are only truths seen through water. At 20 meters depth, the divers entered the first chamber. Their lights revealed shelves of coral-encrusted stone rising from floor to ceiling. Between them, long cavities, niches shaped like scroll racks. Inside, transparent cysts of calcite had formed around what appeared to be cylindrical forms. When touched, they flaked into white dust that drifted away like snow. Helena realized they were hollow imprints, the ghosts of scrolls dissolved by centuries of salt, preserved not as text but as shape. Farther in, they discovered a second chamber. Its ceiling had collapsed, letting a shaft of light pierce the water like a column. Beneath it stood a slab engraved with faint lines of linear A. The script was partial, but one phrase repeated, "Memory is water that forgets itself." The letters were etched with a steady hand. Whoever carved them had known they would be read by light alone. Helena brushed away the silt from a nearby wall and found a mosaic of small stones, surprisingly intact. It depicted what seemed to be scribes seated by the shore, dipping reed pens into bowls, writing as the tide approached. The last panel showed the same men, the same scrolls, but underwater, still writing. The implication was unmistakable. They had built a library meant to be submerged. Back on the surface, the team examined fragments recovered from the site, flakes of fired clay, hardened in salt. Under microscope, they revealed micro-inscriptions, thousands of minuscule marks arranged in spirals. The symbols were too small for the human eye to carve without assistance. Some hypothesized they were natural mineral fractures, but others, Helena included, believed them deliberate, an early form of condensed recording, perhaps even a protoscript encoded through vibration rather than stroke. The ancients, she thought, had learned to write in salt. As the days passed, the cavern revealed further secrets. Within its deepest hall, a long trough carved into the floor contained layers of fine sediment alternating with crushed shells, geological strata arranged like pages. When scanned with sonar, the layers produced tonal variations, much like grooves on a phonograph. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The library was not built to preserve words, but sound, the resonance of water passing through its chambers. Helena began to map the layout as if reading a book. The entrance formed the prologue, the stairway from light to silence. The first shelves held the shapes of memory, scrolls erased yet remembered by absence. The second chamber, the mosaic, was the act of devotion, the scribes writing into the tide. The final chamber was the codex of the ocean itself, inscribed by flow. She began to suspect that the builders had intended this library as a memorial to loss, a place where knowledge would dissolve, not endure. It was a paradox, to remember by forgetting, to archive by surrendering to water. Each evening, she wrote her observations by hand, resisting the temptation to digitize. The glow of her lamp reflected in the still sea, mirroring the shimmer of the chamber below. Her notes became softer, slower. Every civilization, she wrote, builds one library meant to disappear. On the final dive, she lingered alone in the upper chamber. The light shaft cut through the water like glass. Tiny fish moved between the stone shelves, their movements deliberate, almost reverent. She turned off her torch. Darkness filled the space with an order she could not name. The current moved gently through the niches, humming as it passed. She realized then that the library was still performing its purpose, the tide reading its own archives. When she surfaced, the world above seemed suddenly temporary. The cliffs, the sky, even the words she had written. The waves lapped against the hull of the boat, erasing sound, reshaping silence.